Hello, travelers. It's been a long day for you already. You can now rest here. Listen to boring histories to drift off to sleep. Tonight, we will dive into the topic, how it feels to live in the Black Death global pandemic, and many more. Let's begin. They say the world ends not with a bang, but with a cough. You don't notice it at first. A merchant's child coughing in a port town. A rat scurrying beneath sacks of grain on a ship from the east. A sailor with dark circles beneath his eyes, barely able to speak. Then the bells begin to ring. You wake up in a world not yet aware that it is dying. There is no warning, no headline, no press conference. Just the slow unraveling of ordinary life. A baker who no longer opens his shop. A priest who stops answering his door. The silence of birds that once crowded the market square.
You don't know it yet, but you are living in the year 1347, and the Black Death is coming. Not all at once, but like a long, slow shadow creeping over Europe. It will last for years, and before it ends, 1 in every 3 people you know will be gone. This is not a story of drama. This is a story of waiting, of watching, of wondering, of how people live and keep living, even when the world forgets how to sew. So tonight we'll walk slowly through the dust-covered streets of the 14th century. We'll visit quiet cottages where hope flickers like candlelight. We'll hear the creak of carts carrying the sick, the scratch of quills writing down names soon to be forgotten, and the stillness between one breath and the next. Because this is how history moves when no one is watching, and this is how it feels to live through the Black Death. Before we continue on with the story, leave a comment down to let me know where you are joining in from, and what time is it at your place. The days are slower now. You rise when the light creeps through the cracks in the shutters, casting pale golden lines across the stone floor. Morning doesn't feel like it used to. The songs of the church bells have become rare, and when they ring for death. You know the sound now, the soft, slow toll that seems to hang longer in the air. Your village is quiet, not silent, not yet. There are still voices, whispers mostly, the shuffle of feet along the dirt road, the cautious barter of goods. A loaf of bread passed through a window, a jug of water left by a door. No one touches anymore. No one hugs, no one laughs out loud. Even the children have learned to be still. You don't leave your home often, but when you do, it's a ritual of care. You wrap a cloth around your face. Not because you know it will protect you, but because it feels like it might. You carry dried herbs, sage, lavender, mint. The apothecary said they keep the sickness away. You breathe through them, pretending their scent is a barrier. A wall between your lungs and the invisible death moving through the air. Outside, the streets look the same, but the life has drained from them. Doors are marked with red crosses, chalk symbols that say, "Do not enter." There is illness here. Sometimes a scrap of cloth hangs from the door frame, sometimes nothing at all. You've stopped counting how many there are. You visit your neighbor's home. Her name is Marjorie. She used to bake small apple pies and give them to you when you passed by. You knock softly, no answer. You leave a jug of clean water by the threshold and whisper a prayer. You are not sure she's alive, but you are more afraid to find out than to not know. In the evening the light changes. The sun seems to set faster now. You sit by the hearth, staring into the slow, quiet burn of the fire. Flames move like thoughts, flickering, uncertain, always changing. You think about the things you used to worry about. The harvest, the weather, the price of wool. They feel distant now, as if they belonged to a different life. You hear carts in the distance, wooden wheels on cobblestone. That means the collectors are coming. The ones who gather the bodies. No one speaks to them. They wear masks with glass eyes and long beaked noses filled with sweet-smelling herbs.
They look like crows, like something from a dream you don't want to remember. When they pass by, you bow your head and stay still. Sleep comes slowly. You lie on a straw mattress and close your eyes, listening. Rats skitter in the walls. The wind groans softly through the cracks in the timber. Sometimes you hear sobbing, muffled through the walls of the house next door. Sometimes you hear nothing at all. That silence is worse. You dream of green fields, of bells ringing for weddings instead of funerals, of festivals, dancing, warm bread fresh from the oven. You wake briefly forgetting, then you remember. The world has changed. And still, somehow, you keep waking. One more morning, one more day. The sun still rises. The sky still turns from black to blue. The sparrows still sing. Though fewer now, life continues quietly, stubbornly, even when everything else feels like it's slipping away. You don't trust the doctors, not because they are cruel, not because they wish harm, but because they do not know. And there is something far more frightening about a person who claims to understand death. When death does not obey, they arrive in dark robes, their faces hidden beneath long bird-like masks. The children used to laugh at them once, called them plague crows. No one laughs anymore. The masks are filled with herbs, rosemary, cloves, and myrrh. The doctors say these scents purify the air. They speak of bad humors, of poisoned winds and corrupted blood. They carry sticks to prod and point, so they do not have to touch. They try bloodletting. They say the body must be drained of illness. You've seen it, thin arms with small incisions, crimson droplets staining white linen. The fevered often cry out, or fall into a deep stillness. Sometimes they never wake again. They try poultices and pastes, crushed garlic, rose oil, and ground emeralds. If you're wealthy enough, they burn incense in the sick rooms until the air is thick and heavy. One man was buried wrapped in lavender leaves, his family swearing the scent would keep him pure in the afterlife. You've heard rumors from the city of doctors boiling vinegar and herbs to wash the infected, of temples where monks chant day and night beside the ill, of snake oil merchants offering strange concoctions that glow green in glass bottles, of leeches and spells, of charms tied to wrists and prayers carved into wood. But nothing works. Not really. Some patients recover, yes, but no one can explain why. They say it's chance or sin or fate or favor from God. Sometimes they say nothing at all. The doctors leave quickly now. They do not linger. They do not offer comfort. Only advice scribbled in hasty Latin, handed to a priest or family member like a whispered apology. Boil the sheets, burn the mattress, quarantine the child, close the door. Sometimes they don't even knock. They pass by, eyes hidden behind glass, faces unreadable. They've learned that death will do what it wants, no matter what they wear or say or try to cure. Still they come, because people ask for them, because we are always looking for hope, even when we no longer believe it works. And sometimes they stay just long enough to hold a hand, to press a cloth to a fevered brow. A small kindness, a fragile act in a collapsing world. Not medicine, perhaps, but something close to it. And in these quiet nights, when all you hear are distant footsteps and the rustling of wind through shuttered streets, you wonder perhaps what people need is not healing, but presence. Not answers, but the company of someone who refuses to look away. You watch the doctors as they walk through the village. They move like shadows, their long robes brushing the ground, their hands gloved in leather. Their presence does not bring comfort. They do not knock on doors with urgency. They drift, slow and deliberate, like mourners at a funeral that never ends. The mask is the most unforgettable thing. Long and curved like a bird's beak, stuffed with a bouquet of dried herbs. Inside they layer rose petals, mint camphor, sometimes crushed juniper berries, whatever might overpower the stench of rot and illness. But even with all that perfume, you can still smell the truth beneath it. The sick leave behind a scent that no flower can fully cover. The mask was meant to protect, not just from smell, but from death itself. They believed the plague moved through miasma-poisoned air, thick and corrupted, so the beak became a filter, the robe a shield, the gloves a barrier between skin and sin, and yet they still died. The doctors, the learned men, the ones who studied the stars in the pulse, who could quote Galen and Hippocrates by heart, they died too, just like the shepherd, just like the midwife, just like the beggar in the square. Inside the homes, the treatments begin. They start by bleeding the patient, opening the skin with small knives or leeches. The idea is simple. Sickness is imbalance, and balance can be restored by draining what is foul. You've seen the bowls of dark blood, thick and steaming, placed beside the beds like sacrificial offerings. Sometimes the patient screams, sometimes they faint, sometimes they die before the bleeding stops. They try to purge the body. They give infusions of wormwood, rhubarb, even crushed pearls. Some drink potions made of mercury or arsenic, slow poisons meant to drive out the faster one. There are powders from burnt toads mixed with wine, salves made of crushed emeralds and mother's milk, ointments with vinegar, rosewater, and ashes from the bones of saints. There are relics brought in, finger bones from dead martyrs, scraps of fabric said to have touched holy skin. These are pressed against the fevered forehead, held in shaking hands, clutched against the chest like anchors in a storm. The patients often weep, not from pain but from the quiet certainty that this is the end. Some doctors recommend isolation. They urge families to board up the sick in upper rooms, to let them face the end alone. Others suggest open air and sunlight, and drag beds into the street. Still others write elaborate prescriptions, clean linens daily, fumigate the home with rosemary smoke, avoid sadness and bad company. But how can you avoid sadness when the streets are filled with it? The bodies pile up, the carts rattle by, collecting the dead, wrapped in linen or nothing at all. The grave diggers do not speak. Their shovels strike the earth with dull rhythm, day after day. Sometimes the doctors stand near the edge of the trench, writing notes in their little books, trying to understand, to measure, to name something unnameable. There are whispers that the plague is punishment, that it was sent by God for the sins of man. Some believe the doctors are interfering with divine justice. They are cursed, some say, touched by the same pride that brought ruin to Babel. Others defend them, say they are brave, that they walk willingly into hell so others might escape it, and perhaps both are true. You see their eyes sometimes behind the round glass of the mask, tired, sunken, uncertain. They have no cure, only rituals, and when the sick die, they often bow their heads and leave without a word. The churches are not full anymore. They used to be crowded on feast days, the smell of incense hanging thick in the air, the pews packed with villagers murmuring chants in Latin. They did not always understand. The bells would ring with joy, and light would pour through the windows like honey through cracked stone. But now the bells ring only for the dead. You still go, sometimes. You sit near the back in the shadows where no one coughs or leans too close. The priest stands at the altar, his voice quieter than it used to be. He does not thunder anymore. He whispers, like he's afraid that even God might be listening too closely. They say this plague is punishment, that it was sent by God because of our sins. There are sermons filled with fire now, words about wrath and judgment, about a world that has turned its back on holiness. The priest's hands tremble as he speaks. His eyes are red. He's buried too many. He's watched children die in their mother's arms. and he knows deep down that faith doesn't stop a fever from burning through the flesh like wildfire. Still, people come, not as many as before, but some. They kneel before the altar, clutching their rosaries so tight their fingers bruise. They confess everything, every lie, every lustful thought, every stolen coin or secret bitterness, as if the plague were a divine ledger, and they might erase their names from the list if they just wept hard enough. The church has begun to smell of fear and smoke and old wine. In the countryside, rumors travel faster than horse hooves. There are pilgrims walking barefoot across Europe, dragging chains behind them, whipping their backs with barbed cords until the skin breaks. They sing hymns as they bleed. They call themselves the flagellants. They believe the plague is God's anger made flesh, and only pain will satisfy him. You saw them once, passing through the village like a storm of voices, their white robes stained with blood, their eyes wild and distant. They stopped in the square, dropped to their knees and beat themselves until their bones showed. No one stopped them. Some joined them. Some think they are holy. Others think they are mad. There are those who speak of witches, of heretics, of hidden sinners, whose secret crimes have drawn the poison into the world, people in to watch their neighbors with suspicion. An old woman who talks to birds is eyed differently now. A midwife who knows too much is asked too few questions. People are looking for blame, looking for a reason, because reason is slipping, because every prayer that goes unanswered deepens the silence in your soul, and yet faith persists. Not always in churches, sometimes in the little things, a mother pressing a cross into a dying son's hands, a farmer kneeling in a field, whispering to the sky, a candle lit each evening on the windowsill, flickering against the gathering dark. Even those who say they no longer believe still look up when thunder rolls, still cross themselves when they pass the graves. It's not always about salvation. Sometimes it's just about meaning. Because when the world no longer makes sense, the heart will cling to anything that does, even if it's just the rhythm of an old prayer, a song sung not for rescue but for remembering that once there was light, and maybe someday there will be again. You begin to notice the prayers changing. They used to be gentle, familiar things, litanies spoken in unison, whispered comforts passed from grandmother to child. But now the prayers are desperate. They are chanted faster, louder, as though volume could carry them further into the heavens. Some shout them in the streets with cracked voices and bare feet. Eyes roll toward skies that do not answer. Others bury them deep in their throats, mouthed silently as they walk past yet another boarded-up home. Everywhere people search for new words. Old verses are twisted, repurposed, stretched thin to fit this monstrous new shape of the world. Some invent their own prayers entirely, half superstition, half hope, words never meant to reach heaven, but only to soothe their own shaking hands. There are gatherings now, secret and strange, small circles forming in the woods outside the village, cloaked in mist and candlelight. People kneel in mud and sing songs that don't belong to any church. They carve symbols into bark and burn herbs unfamiliar to most. Not all of them believe these rites will save them, but they believe it might make the dying slower, the nights quieter. And for some that's enough. The church grows more powerful in the cities, and yet more fragile in the hearts of the people. Bishops ride through the streets in gold-trimmed carriages, blessing the air with wide, sweeping gestures. They wear rings crusted with jewels, robes heavy with embroidery. But beneath the weight of tradition, their eyes betray a hollow sort of fear. They speak of God's plan, but when they think no one is watching, they clutch their chests and whisper private prayers. Not in Latin, in their mother tongue. You see monks collapse mid-sermon. You see nuns tending to the dying with quiet bravery, even as their own lips begin to darken. One priest in a nearby town locked himself in his chapel and would not come out, not even for his own sister's burial. He left food outside for the mice and sang hymns alone, until the songs turned into sobbing. Some try to atone on a grand scale. Entire villages march together in procession, barefoot on cobblestone, flogging their backs raw while carrying wooden crosses. They cry out for forgiveness, not just for themselves, but for everyone. For kings and beggars, for drunks and thieves, for the newborns who have not sinned, and the widows who have suffered too much to remember what guilt even feels like. These rituals do not stop the dying, but they give the illusion of motion, of doing something in a world that has otherwise come to a halt. And then there are the scapegoats. When prayers fail and incense fades, people begin to look around with narrowed eyes. Jews are blamed first, accused of poisoning wells, of summoning curses, of calling demons in foreign tongues. Some are dragged into the streets and beaten. Others are burned. Entire communities vanish overnight. The church speaks sometimes against the violence, but not often, not loudly enough, because when fear metastasizes, it needs a target. And faith, when bent by desperation, can become a weapon. You see it all, and wonder if this is what judgment truly looks like. Not fire from the sky, not angels with trumpets, but humans shivering and hollow-eyed, collapsing beneath the weight of their own explanations, trying to stitch meaning into something that may not have any, and yet, in the stillness of night, sometimes you still pray, not loudly, not with confidence, but with the voice of a child calling out into the dark, hoping someone hears, a single candle, a whispered name, a pause before sleep, not because you believe it will change anything, but because silence is even worse. Let's descend gently now into the quieter collapse, the kind that doesn't come with screams but with silence. We'll watch the scaffolding of society crack, not all at once, but piece by piece, fields untended, markets abandoned, coins losing meaning, a strange and brutal rebirth taking shape inside the hollow left behind. And still our witness, our unnamed soul, remains among the living, walking through a world that has begun to forget what it was. At first, it's just the small things. The bakery down the road no longer opens its doors. The smell of fresh bread, once warm and thick in the morning air, is gone. The blacksmith's hammer falls silent. No more ringing iron, no more sparks in the night. You pass the empty stalls of the town square, fruit left to rot, cloth stiff with dust, coins scattered like pebbles with no hands to collect them. It isn't chaos, not exactly. It's more like unraveling. There are fewer people every week, and the ones that remain walk slower, speak softer, look past you instead of at you. You start to forget certain sounds. Laughter in the tavern, children shouting in the streets, the crack of a whip in the market, calling oxen to move. Gone. Entire families vanish between one sunrise and the next. Doors are left swinging open. Fireplaces still smoldering. Sometimes the bodies are inside, sometimes not. And then come the wild things. Foxes in the alleys, crows nesting in rooftops, weeds pushing up through the cracks in the church steps. The line between village and forest begins to blur. Nature doesn't mourn, it returns. The manor house atop the hill no longer sends riders into the town. Its lord is dead, they say, or mad, or hiding in a room sealed with wax and crosses. Whatever power he held is buried with him. No one takes his place. But something strange begins to happen as the nobility crumble and the wealthy retreat behind locked gates. The common people begin quietly to rise. Not in rebellion, in necessity. There are fields to be plowed and not enough hands. So those who used to toil for pennies begin to ask for more, and if the Lord Steward refuses, they leave. Because there are always more fields, more empty manors, more places desperate for workers. The laborers are no longer invisible. They are needed, and they know it. You hear it whispered, wages rising, contracts offered, serfs walking away from their masters and never looking back. There are whispers of towns where no one rules anymore, where people vote on who tends the land and how bread is shared. The word freeman starts to mean something new. Guilds begin to lose their grip. Apprentices take over the shops of masters who never returned. Widows open their husbands' stalls and trade under their own names. A young girl begins selling herbs in the square, speaking of things her grandmother taught her in hushed tones. No one dares call her a witch. They need her remedies too much. Coins become strange things. Some hoard them, others refuse them. Barter returns. Bread for boots, wool for salt, a goat for a promise. Entire villages are swallowed whole by the forest, their names erased from maps, their stories kept only in the memories of a few, scattered souls who still speak of them at night, around dwindling fires. But amid the ashes, something is being born, not hope, not yet, but the shape of a new world, still forming in the silence left by the dead. You walk through it with cautious steps. You see women owning land, peasants wearing silk, priests begging for food at the doors of those they once condemned. You hear rumors of cities rebuilding, not as they were, but smaller, stranger, more free, and you realize something no one dared say out loud. The plague has killed millions, but it has also killed order, the divine hierarchy, the noble bloodlines, the invisible chains of peasant and lord, all of them rusted now, their links broken by invisible teeth, and in their place, a blank page, terrifying, empty, beautiful. You look around and wonder who will write on it next. You no longer look at other people the way you used to. There was a time when everyone had a place, a slot in the great machine. Lord, peasant, miller, priest. Roles were assigned, not chosen. You were born into them as fixed as the stars. But now the stars feel closer, and the roles have come undone. You see a woman who once cleaned floors, now weighing grain and commanding laborers. You see a child, an orphan with soot on his cheeks, negotiating the sale of his small family's farm to a merchant who barely escaped the city. You see beggars from before the plague offering shelter to those who once passed them by. No one questions it anymore, because now survival is a kind of nobility, and grief is a kind of passport. If you have lost someone, you belong to the world that remains. People walk differently now. They used to walk with purpose. Now they walk with awareness, always watching, always measuring. They know what an empty street means. They know what it smells like when the air shifts and something rots in the well. Children don't play like they used to. They build graves out of stones. They tie bundles of herbs together and hang them over windows, just like they've seen the old women do. Some try to rebuild the world exactly as it was. They rehire guards. They repaint family crests. They speak in old dialects and enforce long-dead rules. But the people do not follow as easily. The fear has tempered them. They know now what it means to live without protection, to feed themselves, to bury their own dead. And so obedience becomes optional. Whole villages elect their own leaders, not from bloodlines, but from shared trust. A midwife becomes mayor. A former thief oversees harvest distribution. They speak not of laws, but of fairness. They do not wear crowns. They wear worn cloaks, stained by ash and use. You begin to notice how many places are simply abandoned. Once great halls left to ivy and rot. Monasteries filled with bird song instead of bells. The bones of old wealth left behind like empty shells, and there is a strange freedom in this emptiness. People move into old homes without asking permission. They plant gardens in courtyards that once held statues. They break open libraries and read the books no one ever thought a farmer would want. Knowledge no longer belongs to the elite. It is scavenged now, shared, whispered. You hear verses from lost poets spoken by shepherds in the hills. You see scribes teaching children how to write on the backs of old church scrolls. The cities are different, too. Those who return find them quiet, sunlit in a way they never were before. No carts clogging the streets, no shouting vendors, just wind and stone and opportunity. Tradesmen gather in the shells of old markets, and for a while they don't sell anything. They just talk about what went wrong, about what could be better. Some begin to form new guilds, built not on bloodlines but skill. A stonemason and a blacksmith and a tanner pooling their talents, not for profit, but for mutual survival. A word keeps surfacing in these conversations, one you never used much before. Worth? What is a person worth? Is it their name, their land, their gold, or is it their ability to dig a grave without trembling, to raise a child who still laughs, to mend a roof, to share a loaf, to hold a hand when the fever sets in? That question, once philosophical, is now deeply practical. You see it answered in small ways, every day, in who is fed, who is trusted, who is remembered, and for the first time in your life, you begin to feel that society, the shape of it, is not fixed. It is fluid, it bends, it shifts, it forgets, it rebuilds, not always justly, not always well, but always differently. And in that difference, there is the faintest hint of something terrifying and beautiful. Possibility. Let's move into the realm of art, where the world of death, of fear, of loss, and rebirth began to bleed into the human imagination. In the absence of old certainties, people were forced to confront their deepest anxieties about mortality, about what awaited them in the afterlife, about the fragile nature of life itself. The world becomes haunted in more ways than one. It begins in the quiet corners of homes, in the hands of those who still believe in something beyond the veil. Artists paint feverishly. The brush strokes come faster, as though they are trying to capture the fleeting, the ephemeral, the things that might slip away forever, and yet the subjects are darker now. The cherubic angels of the old religious frescoes are replaced with skeletal Lees figures with hollow eyes that seem to gaze not just at you, but through you. Death is not new, but now it is ever present, ever watching, a shroud over everything. You see it on the canvas first, a robed figure on horseback, crowned with a crown of thorns, carrying an hourglass in one hand and a scythe in the other. The figure's face is shrouded, but its eyes are wide, knowing it is the figure of the Grim Reaper, the personification of death, whose shape has never seemed as real, as tangible as it does now. In the corners of painted scenes, you find death's disciples, mourners, plague doctors, lost souls in tattered robes, wandering the scorched earth of a dying world. These are not the saints, the angels, the faithful figures of old religious works. These are the broken, the lost, the mourners who cannot find salvation. A strange new thing emerges in these depictions, a focus on the decay of life. The emphasis is not just on the moment of death, but on the long creeping journey toward it. Decay is not ugly, it is strangely beautiful, vividly green, blue, purple, the changing colors of the body, the slow curve of time passing, the flowers that grow from the graves, the roots that spiral into the earth, the insects that feed on the fallen. Life and death become intertwined in a way that is almost poetic. Painters are not the only ones capturing this. Sculptors, too, begin to carve figures that look like they've been half-formed from the earth itself. Shrouded, gaunt, twisted, they are neither saints nor sinners. They are just human. Human and mortal and fragile. What is life now but a fleeting, temporary state? The afterlife, a world where all the suffering, all the unanswered questions, all the confusion of the plague may finally come to rest, is painted as both a comfort and a terror. The dance of death becomes a popular motif. Figures, dressed as peasants, lords, priests, and soldiers, dance in a wide circle with skeletal companions. No one is excluded. Death does not care for rank. It dances with all of them, gently at first, then faster, until no one can catch their breath, and you realize it is not just a dance, it is a chase. In literature, too, this dark fascination grows. The plague infects the pages as much as it does the bodies of the living. You hear stories of survivors who fall into deep reveries, wondering aloud what really lies beyond the grave. The old religious tropes no longer feel enough. They want more explanation, more meaning, and the written word, the scrolls, the books, the parchments, become the vessels of these long haunted thoughts. There is a shift in storytelling. Before the plague, the narratives were centered around morality, good versus evil, saints and sinners, redemption and damnation. But now, those stories feel shallow. What is good when everything is so fragile? What is evil when all are destined to die, whether from the sword or the sickness? Instead, writers begin to explore themes of fate, how fragile the human life really is. They write of unanswerable questions about the afterlife, of visions, strange, inexplicable encounters with those long dead, of dreams feverish, hallucinatory states that blend waking life with an eternal, distant truth. Some write of heaven, others of hell, but many write of purgatory, that murky space between life and death where no one knows what happens next, a place where the soul lingers, caught between the sins of the past and the hope of some future peace. Is that where the plague survivors go? Will they wander in purgatory forever? Is there anyone to guide them through it? The imaginations of the living are stretched, torn by the weight of too much death, and in this collective grief, something new is born, something strange, not entirely hopeful, not entirely despairing, but a shared, deepened understanding of the fragility of the human soul, a recognition that life itself is a brief thing, always teetering on the edge of loss. And in this recognition, people begin to speak of the unseen, the invisible world. They dream of angels not as divine, but as witnesses, standing silently by the edge of life, never touching, never intervening. They write of spirits who no longer roam the earth, but linger in forgotten corners of towns, hidden in the folds of time. In the wake of the plague, the arts become a language for the things that cannot be spoken aloud, things too terrible to articulate in the daylight. The grotesque and the beautiful, the fleeting and the eternal, all mixed together. The past no longer feels safe, not when death has taken such a familiar shape. And so the future, what comes next, becomes the focus. The stories grow darker, more complex, more filled with the ambiguity of what awaits. The Black Death in its wake left more than physical bodies. It tore through the very psyche of the survivors, unraveling not just their lives but the fabric of reality itself. The dead were so numerous, their absence so complete, that to walk through any village or town meant stepping into a landscape of silence, a silence that was more deafening than the cries of the suffering that had preceded it. Survivors, those few who had escaped the plague's relentless grip, were often left in a state of numbness, their emotions dulled by the enormity of the loss. Many could not cry, There was simply nothing left to cry for. In a world where death had become so commonplace that it was no longer shocking, grief began to lose its edges. People did not mourn the individual losses so much as they mourned the absence of the world they had known. Those who lived had no choice but to move on. But how does one move on when everything around them has been reduced to ash? How does one rebuild a life when it seems as though everything that once gave life meaning, the bonds of family, the structure of society, the certainty of faith, has been torn apart? What was the point of surviving when the very survival seemed like a cruel twist of fate? The survivors carried the invisible weight of trauma in their bodies and minds. Some experienced the kind of grief that leads to disassociation, a psychological response to overwhelming loss. They separated themselves from the emotional impact of their surroundings. Their minds, in a way, protected them by building walls between themselves and the horrors they had witnessed. But disassociation was not always a protective measure. For many, the effects of the plague were permanent. Survivors sometimes suffered from deep anxiety, their minds constantly preoccupied with the fear that death could strike again at any moment. The air they breathed, the people they saw, the food they ate, everything was suspect. Life was fragile, and in the wake of the Black Death, uncertainty was the only certainty. The fear of reinfection was persistent. Many survivors lived in constant dread that the sickness might come again, bringing with it the same ruthless devastation. And even if they were spared, the memories of the plague would never be forgotten. Families who had been torn apart by the disease might have been left with deep resentment or guilt, especially if one member had survived while another had not. The weight of survivors' guilt became a heavy burden, a constant whisper in the minds of those who lived, urging them to question, why me? Why was I spared when so many others were not? This mental toll wasn't something that could be healed quickly or easily. Without modern psychological frameworks to understand trauma, many survivors simply carried their wounds in silence. Some turned to the church for solace, hoping that the clergy could offer explanations, prayers, or rituals to heal their troubled souls. But as we know, the church itself was not immune to the plague, and many survivors turned away from religion entirely, feeling abandoned by a God who had allowed such suffering to spread unchecked. This spiritual trauma was perhaps one of the most devastating effects. Once, faith had been the bedrock of society, a constant that could offer hope and structure. But with the scale of the catastrophe, many people began to question the very nature of their beliefs. How could a benevolent God allow such suffering? Was this the punishment of mankind for its sins? Or was this just the cruel randomness of nature? Some turned to radical ideas, embracing mysticism or even heretical movements, hoping to make sense of a world that felt increasingly alien. And yet, even with these spiritual crises, there was a growing sense of community. Survivors, though scarred, found solace in each other. Family bonds, though strained, were often reformed. Those who had lost children might find new joy in the births of others, or in the adoption of orphaned children from nearby towns. There was a subtle rebuilding of society, slow, hesitant but real. People gathered, not just in mourning, but in the hope that they could somehow create a new life out of the wreckage. But for those survivors who had witnessed the full breadth of the plague's destruction, intimacy, even within the family, became fraught. Relationships changed in subtle ways. It was no longer enough to simply live together. The loss had to be shared in a way that hadn't been necessary before. Some found it difficult to trust others, even those they had once loved dearly. How could they form a bond when their world had been reduced to dust? Was it worth it to form new connections only to face the possibility of another tragedy? Grief became collective, and in the aftermath, communities were altered as they were bound together by shared trauma. Some people became hyper-aware of the fragility of life. They turned inward, seeking meaning in isolation, perhaps finding solace in nature, in silence, in solitude. Others became more communal, seeking out the company of others in the hopes of rebuilding what had been lost. Yet there were also those who grew hardened, perhaps even cold in the face of so much suffering. The psychological toll could take many forms. Some became desensitized to death and suffering, while others became obsessed with it. This is when we see the first stirrings of a darker mysticism, a fascination with the occult, with death, with what came after. As a society, people were beginning to come to terms with their own mortality in ways that had been unimaginable before. The Black Death was not just a disease, it was a cultural cataclysm that altered the very essence of what it meant to be human. And as survivors moved forward, they did so with a new understanding, one that was born of grief, fear, and the trauma of living through an event that shattered their world and their sense of self. A young widow's journey. Take the story of a young widow named Isabella, who lived in a small Italian village. When the plague arrived, she watched as her husband and 2 children were claimed by the disease. She was left alone, suddenly bereft of her family, her sense of purpose, and her identity. In the weeks following their deaths, Isabella could not leave the house. She had been unable to bury them, for there were too many dead, and the graves were already overcrowded. Isabella's grief became a phantom. She wandered through the house, haunted by the sound of her children's laughter, the sight of her husband's workbench, untouched. She couldn't bring herself to clean the rooms they had occupied, and each time she entered, she felt a wave of crushing sorrow. Every time she left her home to go into the village, she was confronted with the absence of life. People she had known her entire life were now gone, and the faces around her had become strangers, caught in their own grief. Over time, Isabella began to develop what we would now recognize as symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, nightmares, flashbacks to the moment her family had died, and a feeling of hypervigilance. She couldn't relax. Every part of her body was on edge, her mind constantly scanning for danger, yet there was nowhere to turn for help. Medicine was rudimentary, and the clergy were consumed with their own challenges, struggling to make sense of the devastation. Isabella's grief never truly faded. She found solace in prayer, but even this felt hollow, a ritual she performed not out of faith but out of habit. She would eventually remarry, but the emotional scars of the Black Death remained with her forever, unsoaken and raw, a constant presence in the corners of her life. A father's struggle with survivor's guilt. Then there's Joriot, a father from a small village in France. He had survived the plague, but not without heavy losses. His wife and youngest child died within days of each other. He was left with 2 children, his eldest son, Luca, and his daughter, Valentina. As the plague ravaged his family, Joriot had watched his wife struggle to breathe, her eyes wide with panic, her body weakening with every passing hour. She begged him to hold her hand, and he did, powerless to stop her suffering. After her death, Joriot buried her in the family grave, but the guilt he carried never left him. Why did I survive when she didn't? This question haunted him day and night. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't laugh with his children. He had watched as she withered away, and in the quiet of the night, the silence was suffocating. Joriot found that he could no longer connect with people as he once had. His neighbors, who had known him as a strong, jovial man, now saw him as something distant, haunted. His mind was fixated on the what-ifs. What if I had tried harder to protect her? What if we had left earlier? These thoughts plagued him every day. Though he tried to rebuild, to move on, the weight of his survivor's guilt never lifted. His relationship with his children became strained. While he loved them deeply, he could not shake the sense of doom that seemed to follow him. He had survived, but at what cost? The question would stay with him for the rest of his life, woven into every quiet moment of his days. For survivors like Isabella and Giorgio, the trauma of the Black Death was something that couldn't be fixed. It couldn't be erased by time or prayer or even the passing of the seasons. It shaped the way they lived, loved, and thought about the future. And though life did continue, villages rebuilt, families reformed, economies slowly began to recover, the survivors carried the weight of their past with them. The psychological scars of the Black Death were more than just the memories of lost loved ones. They were the lingering shadows that followed survivors wherever they went. The knowledge that death could come suddenly, without warning, and that the world was fragile in a way that no one had truly understood before. It was the fear of never knowing if the world could ever be truly safe again. These stories, while specific to individuals, reflect the broader collective trauma that shaped Europe for generations. The psychological impact of the Black Death would reverberate far beyond the immediate aftermath, influencing everything from art and literature to religion and society. Survivors didn't just rebuild the world they had lost, they carried it with them, forever altered by the horror they had lived through. The Black Death not only tore apart individuals, but also fundamentally restructured the very core of society, the family. The devastating loss of so many people altered the ways families were formed, the roles individuals took on, and the expectations placed on each gender. Let's dive into how the pandemic reshaped the family structure and how it led to profound changes in the roles of women, children, and men. When the Black Death struck, it did so with a merciless efficiency that tore through families without regard for age, gender, or status. Children were orphaned, parents lost their spouses, and siblings were separated in death. Whole households were decimated, leaving behind a scattered and fragile structure where once there had been unity and care. Children in particular bore the brunt of the tragedy. Orphans became a common sight, wandering the streets, sometimes with no one to look after them. Entire generations of young people were left without parents, a fate that drastically altered the way children were raised. With both fathers and mothers often dead, older siblings or extended family members stepped in to take on the role of caregivers. In some cases, grandparents who themselves were often on the brink of death became the only remaining authority figures struggling to care for younger generations. In the absence of biological parents, children learned to lean on one another, developing a sense of community with other orphans, forming alternative familial bonds out of necessity. These orphan children didn't have the same opportunities for childhood as those before the plague. They were forced to grow up quickly, learning survival skills and often working in trades or fields to support themselves. Their lives were marked by a lack of emotional security, the absence of nurturing figures, and an intense need for self-reliance. Some grew up to become street beggars, while others found work as apprentices in the cities, earning their living as best they could in a world where traditional familial structures had crumbled. Even for those families that remained intact after the pandemic, the structure of the family had shifted dramatically. With so many adult men and women gone, children often had to take on responsibilities that were traditionally held by adults. In some cases, older children assumed the role of family heads, taking charge of household decisions and finances, while younger siblings or relatives helped manage day-to-day affairs. This was especially common in rural areas, where labor was needed to maintain the farm or household. Families that once relied on a rigid hierarchy, father as the primary authority, mother as caretaker, had to adapt quickly to new roles. This shift created a more egalitarian model in many households, with mothers taking on a more prominent role in decision-making, managing the family's finances, or overseeing their children's education. Fathers who survived often had to learn to share domestic duties, leading to a less rigid gender division of labor, at least in some areas. But these changes were not without their complications. Tension arose as people struggled to redefine roles and responsibilities in a world that no longer seemed familiar or stable. The Black Death also marked a pivotal moment for women. With so many men dying in the plague, women found themselves in a very different position in the post-pandemic world. For centuries, women had been expected to focus primarily on household duties, childbearing and supporting the economic endeavors of their husbands. But the plague forced a massive shift in these gender roles. With a significant portion of the male workforce wiped out, women were called upon to take on tasks that were previously considered male-dominated. They worked the fields, took over businesses, and filled roles in shops and guilds. In some regions, women took over the family businesses entirely, running farms, shops, and even managing financial accounts. This was especially true in urban areas, where surviving women took on more prominent positions in commerce and trade. It was a unique period in history where the patriarchal structure temporarily loosened, and women were able to establish a stronger foothold in the economic life of their communities. The shift was not always welcomed, however. In some cases, men's jealousy over women's increasing independence led to social conflict. Even in the midst of upheaval, many communities continued to uphold strict gender norms, and women who began to step outside these boundaries were often viewed with suspicion. Nevertheless, the role of women in society was beginning to change in ways that had long-lasting effects on the post-plague world. In many households, the death of a male head of the family meant that the mother or widow had to take on the authority role. Women who survived the Black Death redefined their place within the family, managing not only the domestic side of life, but also the economic well-being of their families. Widows, for example, were often left with property, land, and businesses to manage, which led to an increase in female-led households. This period also saw women play a more active role in the religious and spiritual realms. Without the presence of male priests and monks due to the pandemic, women often assumed positions of influence in the church and religious organizations, helping to care for the sick and provide charity to the poor. In some cases, women became more visible in the practice of healing, utilizing herbs and folk medicine to help treat the sick. In a society where women were often excluded from formal education and religious authority, this shift represented a significant change. The Black Death's impact on family structure didn't just change the roles of parents and children, but also had lasting consequences for social bonding and community life. Families redefined their sense of what it meant to be a family, and in some cases people formed new familial bonds outside the traditional structure. Surviving members of the same community came together in a different way, relying on one another for support. In the wake of so many deaths, communities often had to come together to adopt and care for orphaned children, creating new families formed through mutual need rather than bloodlines. This was especially true in urban centers, where the combination of high mortality and a fractured family unit led to the formation of informal kin networks. In the absence of traditional structures, people began to rely on one another more heavily, sometimes with deep bonds of affection, other times out of sheer necessity. In a more traditional setting, extended families, grandparents, uncles, aunts, played a prominent role in the upbringing of children, and many households involved complex webs of kinship. However, with the plague wiping out so many members of the extended family, these relationships became less central. Instead, smaller, more immediate family units or chosen families emerged as the primary structure for survival and emotional support. The redefinition of gender roles during and after the Black Death wasn't just limited to women. It also created space for a rethinking of masculinity. As men were wiped out in such large numbers, there was a profound questioning of traditional gender expectations. The patriarchal ideal, which had been so deeply ingrained in medieval Europe, began to lose its power, if only for a short while. Men who survived had to adapt to a world where women were taking on roles once held exclusively by men, and this resulted in gender fluidity in both the domestic and public spheres. In the aftermath of the plague, both men and women began to reevaluate the roles that society had imposed on them. While some of these changes were temporary, others had longer-lasting effects. The Black Death accelerated shifts in family dynamics and gender roles, making this one of the most pivotal moments in medieval history for the reshaping of social structures. The Black Death not only ravaged human lives, but it also left a profound mark on the physical landscape of Europe. As death tolls soared and entire populations were wiped out, the social fabric unraveled, leaving cities, towns, and villages abandoned to the elements. This period marked a dramatic shift in the relationship between humanity and the environment. Without human presence, nature began to reclaim what had been lost, and the land underwent transformations that would have far-reaching consequences for the future of Europe. One of the most striking features of the aftermath of the Black Death was the abandonment of entire cities, villages, and towns. As the plague tore through densely populated urban centers, it left a trail of death and destruction that decimated communities. The overwhelming number of bodies, often left unburied due to the sheer volume of the deceased, led to an exodus from many towns. Those who survived fled to the countryside, seeking refuge from the disease, while the cities fell eerily silent. In the wake of the devastation, some areas saw entire populations disappear, leaving behind empty streets and abandoned buildings. The once bustling marketplaces, cobbled streets, and lively neighborhoods became ghost towns, slowly sinking into ruin. The absence of people in these urban spaces allowed nature to reclaim what had been built through centuries of human activity. Nature, unimpeded by human hands, began to encroach on these abandoned urban centers. Overgrown vines crept up the sides of buildings, and trees sprouted through the cracked cobblestones of once thriving roads. As families fled, many homes and businesses were left in disarray, with possessions abandoned in haste. The empty cities became overrun with weeds, grasses, and wildflowers, and animals began to reclaim the spaces once dominated by humans. The silent ruins of cities were gradually reclaimed by the wild, with squirrels, birds, and even wolves venturing into the heart of towns where humans had once walked in droves. The transformation of these spaces was so dramatic that it was as if the cities themselves had been swallowed by the earth. In many regions, the landscape around these abandoned cities began to morph in ways that reflected the absence of human activity. Where once humans had cleared forests for farming or built roads to connect settlements, nature returned to these areas with an intensity that was both beautiful and haunting. In the absence of human influence, the land around the abandoned towns began to heal in ways that were unseen for centuries. Fields that had once been cultivated for agriculture quickly turned to fallow. Crops no longer needed tending, and livestock left behind or slaughtered in the panic were no longer being cared for. With no human hands to tend the soil, the landscape slowly transformed into wild terrain. Forests, which had once been cut down for timber and land to farm, began to reclaim what had been stripped from them. Trees that had once been felled for building materials now had the chance to grow tall and untamed. What had been agricultural fields returned to scrubland, and bushes grew where once there had been carefully planted crops. This reforestation was a natural consequence of the absence of human labor and intervention. The return of forests and wild areas was not uniform. In some places, agricultural land that had once been fertile became invasive or barren. In other areas, the land began to recover, perhaps too slowly for the survivors to notice the full extent of its transformation. Where villages once stood, tall grasses and flowers grew in their place, waving in the wind as a reminder of the city's former life. In some cases, the impact of the Black Death on the environment wasn't just a return to nature, it was a biological shift. The decay of the human population led to an increased presence of rats, which had carried the fleas that spread the plague. As rats multiplied, their ecosystems also changed, contributing to further cycles of disease and death. The presence of dead bodies, often left unburied, created an environment where decomposition and the spread of disease became intertwined with the natural world. However, in the absence of human activity, the worst of these ecological effects eventually began to subside. Fewer humans meant less deforestation, less pollution, and less agricultural pressure on the land. This allowed for a period of ecological recovery as natural cycles resumed without the stress of constant human interference. Beyond the physical transformation, there was a psychological and emotional impact tied to the abandoned cities and towns. To witness the sudden and stark emptiness left by the plague was to confront the void, a space that was once alive with human activity and now silent, haunted only by echoes of the past. For survivors, returning to such places felt like walking into a dreamscape where the familiar had been replaced by the uncanny. The once joyous sound of children's laughter in the streets, the hustle of merchants, the ringing of church bells, all had vanished, leaving only echoes of what had been. To return to an empty town with homes abandoned and shops left to decay must have been an overwhelming experience for those who survived. It would have created a sense of grief and loss that extended beyond just the people. It was the land itself that had been altered, reworked into something alien. In the countryside, the impact was perhaps even more stark. Villages that once flourished as tight-knit communities were now often left desolate, their buildings falling into disrepair. Cattle and crops were abandoned, and only the wind and wild animals populated the spaces where families once lived. Entire villages once full of life and industry were left to the wild. The wild began to push back in other ways, too. With fewer human hunters, some animal species flourished in areas once inhospitable to them. Wolves, bears, and even wild boar began to thrive in the forested areas around abandoned settlements. The relationship between humans and animals was reset, with predators wandering where they hadn't for generations. These creatures found homes in the places that were left empty, and for survivors returning to these lands, the line between civilization and wilderness began to blur. Nature had taken back control in a quiet, unstoppable way. As time passed and populations began to rebuild, some of the abandoned cities and villages were reclaimed by the survivors, yet the land had changed irrevocably. The cultural and ecological landscapes were altered, and the spaces that had been once inhabited were now often seen through a different lens. The Black Death, in its violent interruption of everyday life, served as a reminder of the precariousness of human existence. And in the silence left behind by so many lives lost, the land itself began to reflect the transience of human achievement. While humans rebuilt and began to repopulate these spaces, they could never return to the way things had been, just as the plague itself had irrevocably shifted the course of history. The Black Death, in all its devastation, acted as a catalyst for monumental changes in the field of medicine. While the immediate response to the plague was often rooted in superstition, trial, and error, the lessons learned from the pandemic planted the seeds for the eventual evolution of medical practices. The plague was a defining moment that forced society to confront the limitations of traditional methods and began a slow, transformative shift toward the more scientific and systematic approach that would characterize modern medicine. Physicians, many of whom were trained in ancient Greek and Roman medical theories, had little to offer in terms of effective treatments for a disease as mysterious and deadly as the plague. The medical community still adhered to the humoral theory of disease, which posited that illness was caused by an imbalance of bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. This theory led to treatments like bloodletting, purging, and the use of herbal concoctions, remedies that were not only ineffective against the plague, but often exacerbated the patient's condition. For the common people, medical knowledge was largely dictated by folk medicine, passed down through generations. Herbal remedies, charms, and prayers were the primary forms of treatment. However, many of these practices were based on superstition, and the frantic search for relief often involved ineffective or harmful interventions. As the death toll mounted, Both physicians and folk healers found themselves helpless in the face of a disease they could not understand, let alone treat. In the midst of the plague, there was a growing sense of desperation among physicians. Many believed that the plague was a divine punishment, a punishment from God for the sins of mankind. This belief led some to suggest that the only cure lay in repentance, prayer, and seeking divine intervention. Others, however, tried to understand the plague from a more empirical perspective, observing patterns and trying various treatments, but with little success. Some physicians, particularly in the growing universities of Europe, began to question the ancient teachings and sought to examine medical practices in a more critical way. A few even began to explore the idea that the disease was spread by something unseen, though the germ theory of disease would not be fully realized until centuries later. Some early pioneers in medicine proposed that the disease spread through the air, though this was still a largely speculative theory. While the Black Death was devastating in its immediate effects, it forced society to reconsider how illness was managed on a larger scale. One of the most profound changes was the establishment of quarantine measures and the beginning of public health systems. In many cities, authorities began to isolate the sick, placing them in plague houses or hospitals designed specifically to house victims of the plague. These institutions, while rudimentary by modern standards, marked a shift in the way society dealt with infectious diseases. The idea of separating the sick from the healthy laid the groundwork for modern public health measures. It highlighted the need for dedicated healthcare spaces to care for the ill, and this led to the gradual creation of institutions that would evolve into hospitals. In some regions, public health laws were enacted to regulate the movement of people, the handling of bodies, and the care of the sick. These early quarantine practices were some of the first steps toward what would later become a global public health infrastructure. Though medicine during the Black Death was largely governed by tradition and superstition, the failure of conventional treatments created an intellectual vacuum, a desire to understand that would shape future medical advancements. The plague prompted more questioning and a gradual shift toward a more evidence-based scientific approach. As European society began to rebuild after the plague, physicians and scholars began to turn away from ancient dogma and toward observation, experimentation, and empirical evidence, key principles that would eventually shape the development of the scientific method. Though the scientific method would not fully come into play until the Renaissance and the rise of experimental science, the groundwork had been laid by the plague. Physicians, forced to confront the limits of their knowledge, began to look for explanations beyond religious or superstitious interpretations. They started to document and analyze the patterns of the disease, experimenting with different treatments, even if those treatments were still crude by modern standards. In a way, the trauma of the Black Death helped to shift the mindset of medical practitioners from one rooted in tradition to one seeking observable, reproducible results. Another lasting legacy of the Black Death was the evolution of hospitals. Prior to the plague, hospitals existed primarily for religious or charitable purposes, providing basic care for the poor and sick, often in rudimentary conditions. However, the overwhelming need for care during and after the plague prompted changes in how hospitals were structured and operated. Hospitals became more specialized, focusing on the care of the sick rather than serving only as places for the poor or those in need of charity. The plague showed how epidemics could overwhelm a community, leading to a more organized, systematic approach to the care of the ill. Eventually, hospitals began to be seen as medical institutions where trained physicians could diagnose, treat, and care for patients, marking the early development of modern healthcare systems. In addition, the creation of public health authorities and the regulation of hospitals led to an increased focus on cleanliness, sanitation, and the management of infectious diseases. These concepts, which would eventually become central to modern medicine, were first tested during the plague years, even if many of the specific measures were not fully understood at the time. While medical knowledge advanced slowly after the Black Death, folk medicine remained a prominent part of healthcare in many communities. Though the plague showed the limitations of traditional remedies, many people continued to rely on herbal treatments. charms, and prayers as they grappled with the trauma of the pandemic. In some ways, folk medicine persisted even as more formal healthcare systems began to take shape. Many rural areas still relied on local healers, midwives, and herbalists who blended traditional knowledge with emerging medical practices. The belief in magic and supernatural forces did not vanish with the Black Death. It remained an important aspect of healing for centuries to come. Though the Black Death caused immeasurable suffering, it also set the stage for the eventual development of modern medicine. The epidemic forced a rethinking of healthcare, a shift toward more systematic and scientifically grounded approaches. The practice of quarantining the sick, the formation of hospitals, and the increasing desire for knowledge and empirical evidence all laid the foundation for future medical breakthroughs. By forcing societies to confront the fragility of life and the limitations of existing medical knowledge, the Black Death became a catalyst for change. The lessons learned during the plague years, both good and bad, helped shape the course of medicine and public health for centuries to come, eventually contributing to the development of vaccines, the establishment of global health organizations, and the modern hospitals we know today. A day in the life of a citizen in ancient Rome. The first light of morning brushes gently across the rooftops of Rome, turning their terracotta tiles a muted gold. Somewhere beyond the still-shadowed forum, a rooster calls, its voice cutting through the thin mist that clings to the alleys like breath on cold marble. The city is not yet loud, not yet alive. It wakes slowly, in layers. You stir on your straw-stuffed mattress. The stone walls of your insula, your apartment hold the chill of the night, though the air outside is warming. From a narrow window you can just catch a sliver of the pale sky. You hear water dripping in the courtyard below, a clay jug being filled, footsteps of a neighbor heading to the public latrine. You rise and wrap a tunic across your body, rough linen, stiff at the edges. Your feet find their sandals, worn but familiar. Before you step into the street, you tie the folds of your clothing with a simple belt. You are no patrician, no senator, just a Roman, one among many. Outside, the city stretches around you, vast, layered, living. The baker's oven is already hot. You can smell the yeasty scent of flat loaves browning inside. As you pass, he nods silently and hands you one for a copper coin, still warm. You tear off a piece, letting the steam rise in the crisp air. There is something sacred in this bread, though you do not say it aloud. Further down, a temple gate is opening. Priests dressed in pristine white move like spirits through the columns, setting offerings upon the altar, wine, oil, a garland of leaves. You do not enter, but you pause. Just for a moment, the smoke of incense climbs into the sky like a whispered prayer. You touch your fingers to your chest, then your lips, and move on. Vendors are beginning to shout now, their voices bouncing off marble and stone, offers of olives, wool, figs, and saltfish. The forum is still quiet, but soon the orators will begin. You pass beneath statues of men long dead, their eyes carved to stare forever into history. Their robes are idealized, their postures perfect. You wonder if they ever wore tunics that itched or sandals that pinched. You cross paths with a group of children playing with knuckle bones, laughing in bursts as they toss and catch the small pieces. A girl runs barefoot through the square, her laughter trailing like a ribbon. Somewhere nearby, a water carrier calls out, his yoke creaking beneath the weight of twin amphorae. As the sun climbs, so does the heat. You make your way toward the thermae, the public baths, not a luxury, but a ritual. A part of daily life. You pass under arches into the dim corridors, where bodies echo in murmurs and wet footsteps. You undress and leave your clothes with the attendant. First the tepidarium, the warm room, where steam loosens your skin, then the caldarium, hot as a kiln, where sweat beads instantly. You sit on the stone bench, eyes half closed, listening to the drip of water and the hollow sound of voices on tile. There are men discussing politics, some whispering gossip, others simply silent, lost in thought. The baths are where the world slows down, where the weight of labor peels off with the grime. In the frigidarium, the cold pool shocks your system. You inhale sharply, then exhale, and in that breath you feel something like renewal. Outside again, the sun is high. Work resumes. You pass laborers chiseling stone, scribes copying texts in shaded corners, merchants weighing grain. You see women sweeping doorways, boys delivering messages, old men nodding in the sun. A mosaic artist crouches in the dust, carefully placing blue glass into wet mortar, an eye in progress. You pause again at the edge of the forum, where an old philosopher sits cross-legged, muttering softly to a few listeners. He speaks of virtue and duty, of the mos maiorum, the way of the ancestors. His voice is cracked like old papyrus, but there is peace in his rhythm. You don't stay long, but you carry the cadence with you as you walk. By late afternoon, the air smells of dust and figs. Shadows grow long, and the market begins to fold itself away. Musicians drift from street to street, pipes and lyres, a soft drum. You see couples strolling, neighbors arguing, children begging for honey cakes. The sky is turning apricot, then indigo. Dinner is simple, lentils, bread, a bit of cheese and watered wine. You eat slowly, seated a worn stool, listening to the quiet. A neighbor sings. Another sharpens a knife. You light a small oil lamp and watch the flame tremble. Before sleep, you step once more outside. The stars above Rome are distant, hazy, but present. Somewhere in the darkness, dogs bark. The Tiber flows, unseen but constant. The city does not sleep fully. It hums, it breathes, but your eyes are heavy. Tomorrow will be much the same, and somehow that is a comfort. The sun has long since dipped below the western hills, and the city has exhaled. Rome by night is not silent, but it is softened. The clamor of voices is replaced by low murmurs. Torches flicker on corners, their flames swaying like reeds in a slow current. Lamps glow behind shutters. You walk more carefully now. There are cracks in the stones, shadows in the alleys, stories in every echo. The temperature has dropped, and the scent of the day of dust, bread, and sweat has been replaced by something colder, something more metallic. The scent of stone, of oil, of quiet. You pass a fountain where a few stray dogs lap at the water. One lifts its head to watch you pass, then returns to the bowl. Not far away, the local vigils patrol with slow steps. Rome's night watch, part fire brigade, part guard, part comfort. You nod to them, and they return the gesture without a word. In some parts of the city, they're the only line between safety and crime. In others, they're part of the crime. But here they're just men, awake when others sleep. Above, the sky spreads wide and open. No towering apartment walls can block the stars entirely. You can still trace constellations between roof lines. Jupiter glows bright tonight, like a watchful eye. You wonder what the augurs might say, what omens the heavens whisper when the world is sleeping. Behind closed doors, families gather around small meals and softer voices. Fathers tell their children the myths of Romulus and Remus, of Mars and Venus, of gods who still seem close enough to hear. Mothers sew in lamplight, mending what the day wore thin. Some lovers sneak into shadows. Some husbands don't come home. Such is Rome, ever constant, ever changing. Somewhere in the Subura, A group of revelers begins to sing, slurred, joyful, slightly off-key. Wine flows more freely at night, when debts are forgotten and masks are set aside. You can hear a flute, a tambourine, laughter, then a scuffle, then quiet again. You walk a little further, past closed tabernae and sleeping shops. Outside one doorway, a pair of sandals lies abandoned, worn thin at the heel. You wonder who left them, and why. There are no answers in the dark. You reach your home once more, a small square room with a curtained threshold and a shelf of simple belongings. You light another lamp. It throws shadows along the walls, dancing gently with the flicker of the flame. The bed welcomes you with creaks and the faint scent of straw. You remove your belt, fold your tunic, and settle into the quiet. From your bed you can still hear Rome breathing. The drip of a gutter, a baby's cry in the distance, a door closing, a chorus of crickets. You close your eyes and the hum of the city cradles you. Tomorrow will come, the forum will fill, the bakers will rise, the sun will warm the stones once more. But for now, in this deep hour of the night, Rome belongs to shadows and sleep. You rest, knowing you are part of something vast, something ancient, layered with memory and myth. And as you drift, perhaps the last thing you hear is not a voice, not a step, not a whisper, but the heartbeat of the eternal city itself. We follow the quiet world of a Roman slave, not the kind chained to the galley oar or cast into the mines that fate is brutal and short. This is a household slave, bound not by iron, but by duty, a life that moves in whispers behind the marbled walls of power. You rise before the light does, long before your masters stir, before the hearth is lit or the dogs bark. You are already awake. You've learned to move quietly, to breathe without sound. Your bed is a straw mat in a corner of the kitchen, close to the fire when there is one, cold when there isn't. You stretch, not to ease your muscles, but to make sure they still obey. Your name isn't your own. It was given to you like your clothes, like your tasks, like your silence. You light the fire, careful to keep it small. The wood is precious, rationed. Your fingers move automatically. Bread dough to knead, jugs to fill, floors to sweep. The villa is a fine one, owned by a minor senator, whose wealth drips from statues and silk. But wealth doesn't clean itself. In the stillness of the morning, you hear only your own movements. The flick of the broom, the hiss of oil on the pan, the creak of beams overhead. Every sound is measured, known. The day's rhythm is one you've memorized, like a second heartbeat. You serve the family their meal without meeting their eyes. You've learned not to be seen. The patrician woman sips her watered wine, adjusts her shawl. The son complains about his tutor. The father, bored already, asks for dates and honey. You bring them, you always bring them, but you watch, you listen, every word, every glance, every mood change. It's all part of your survival. You must know when not to speak, when to step back, when to disappear into the edges of the room. Midday is the worst. The sun beats through the windows, the heat soaks your tunic. You carry baskets from market, empty chamber pots, scrub footprints from marble. Your hands are always moving, but your mind floats elsewhere, to a village you barely remember, to a language you no longer speak aloud, to a name no one calls you by. You pass another slave in the hall, an older woman. She nods slightly. It's not affection exactly, but it's something, a threat, a reminder that you're not entirely alone in this life behind the curtain. Sometimes there are moments of gentleness. You hold the patrician child while he cries from a scraped knee. He clutches your hand and falls asleep, and for a moment you feel what? Not freedom, but maybe warmth, the echo of humanity. And when night falls and the lamps are lit, and the villa quiets once more, you return to your mat. You curl your knees to your chest and press your fingers to your eyelids. as if pressing down on memory. Outside Rome hums with voices and celebration, but you are behind the walls, always behind the walls. Still, you dream of fields, of running barefoot, of singing loudly without punishment. You dream of your mother's voice, of your real name, of the sea, because even in chains, even in servitude, the mind seeks the stars, and in sleep, even a slave is briefly free. Let us now trade the shadows of the servants' quarters for the polished light of the atrium, marbled floors beneath slippered feet, perfumed air behind carved doors. Let us walk not as one who serves, but as one who is served, still bound, but by expectation, not chains. You are a patrician woman in the heart of Rome, daughter of one noble house, wife to another, born into a world of silk and politics, of rituals and appearances. You are cloaked in privilege, but that cloak weighs heavily. The day begins gently. Your maid wakes you before the sun fully climbs. She speaks softly, her voice practiced, unobtrusive. You open your eyes not to chaos or labor, but to the filtered light through linen curtains and the scent of rosewater. You are not cold, you are not hungry, but you are not entirely free either. Bathing is a ceremony. Warm cloths, oils, a slow comb through your hair. You do not dress yourself. You are adorned, rings, fibulae, earrings, each piece chosen not for comfort, but for how it speaks to others. Every detail is part of a language, a message to the world. This is who I am. This is where I stand. You break your fast lightly. Figs, barley cakes, honeyed wine. Then comes the procession of daily duties. Not physical, but social. A visit to the temple, perhaps to Vesta, whose fires you revere. A sacrifice, a whispered prayer for your husband's political ambitions, for your child's health, for your own place in this intricate web of expectations. You're seen in the porticos, in the shade of the colonnades. You speak with other women in careful tones. There is always a game being played of reputation, of alliance, of silent comparisons. Whose husband has risen, whose daughter is of marrying age, who has recently fallen from grace. Your life, though wrapped in silk, is not entirely your own. You did not choose your husband. You did not choose this role, but you perform it with grace, with calculation. You know which slaves to trust, which glances to return, which rumors to ignore, and which to plant gently, like seeds. By midday you return home. The atrium is cooler now. You read scrolls, perhaps Ovid, if you're daring, or maybe you write a letter to a sister far away. Sometimes you teach your children, reciting Virgil or Homer, instructing them in the stories of gods and ancestors. You shape their minds as carefully as you shape their posture. But there are moments when the mask slips. In the garden, alone beneath the cypress trees, you let your hands run over the smooth edge of the fountain. You listen to the water. You watch a bee drift between blossoms, and you wonder, what would it be to be a man in this city, to speak in the Senate, to own your own life? You do not say this aloud. You do not even write it, but you think it, and you are not alone. At night, you host a small gathering. Your husband's colleagues, their wives, the dining couches are arranged just so. You do not dine alongside the men. You dine separately, unless custom or circumstance allows, but your presence is felt. Your words, though few, are sharp. You are not invisible. You have learned the power of subtlety. Later, after the guests leave and the servants clean in silence, you retire. Your room is quiet, perfumed with lavender. You dismiss your maid with a nod, and in that stillness you finally breathe deeply. You are a patrician woman. You are watched, admired, feared, restricted. But within these marble walls, within the folds of your stola, you carry stories, thought, hopes, a world of your own. And as you drift into sleep, perhaps dreaming of Elysium, or simply of a world where your voice rises louder than a whisper, you know that even within the gilded cage, you remain entirely alive. You are born into marble and expectation. The walls of your childhood are painted with frescoes, scenes of myth and triumph, where gods descend into mortal affairs and women are often spectators or sacrifices. You learn early to be still, to observe, to smile without showing too much desire. Even your toys are quiet. Ivory dolls with jointed limbs, miniature dishes for imaginary feasts. Your education, while not as rigorous as your brother's, is far from empty. You are taught to read and write Latin fluently, perhaps even some Greek. You read poetry aloud for rhythm, rhetoric, and grace. But your lessons are not just of language or myth. They are of control. How to move, how to bow, how to respond without offense. Your greatest subject is propriety. You are to be poised at all times, never too passionate, never too withdrawn. Marriage comes early, likely arranged before your first bleeding. Your husband is older, of course, an ally to your father, a rising figure in the Senate. You do not know him when you marry him. You may not grow to love him, but you will learn how to be his wife, how to present his name at public banquets, how to bear him sons, how to keep your thoughts quietly yours. The villa becomes your stage. Its layout is yours to memorize. The atrium where guests are received, the tablinum where your husband works, the triclinium for dining. But your domain is the interior world, the private chambers, the garden cloisters, the spaces where public eyes do not linger. Here, you exercise the only kind of authority permitted to you. You manage slaves, you oversee meals, you decide which flowers fill the fountain bowls. You are, in this sense, a governor of invisible things. You've mastered the art of influence through absence. At social gatherings, you rarely speak politics aloud, but your presence shapes alliances. A nod, a compliment, a story shared at the right time. These are your tools. You've watched your husband rise, in part through your skillful silences. Still, you have a mind, a rich private one. When you read alone, you linger over lines in Lucretius or Sappho. You are moved not just by the words, but by the freedom they suggest of loving who you choose, of asking forbidden questions, of existing outside duty. Sometimes you even write small things, verses not meant for circulation, hidden beneath the cedar box with your jewelry. You write to remember who you are, beneath the robes and the posture. Motherhood changes you. If you have daughters, you weep a little for them, not where anyone sees, of course, but deep inside. You know what waits. If you have sons, you bear them like gifts to the Republic. Their laughter becomes your oxygen, their mistakes your sleepless nights. You age with grace, as expected. Your hair grays, your voice softens, but your mind sharpens. You have survived childbirth, gossip, the wheeling games of Roman society. You have made yourself necessary, respected, even feared in subtle ways. Your power is not worn like a general's armor. It's stitched invisibly into the hem of your tunic. It's in the way people lower their voices when you enter, in the way your husband listens when you speak of someone's character. He would never say you guide him, but he does not move without your counsel. And at night, when you finally slip away from the weight of performance, you sit alone beside the garden pool. The moon reflects on the water. The jasmine breathes its scent into the air. You remember a time, long ago, when you imagined love to be simple, life to be yours. You smile, not bitterly, but knowingly. You have built a kingdom from shadows. You are not free, but you are not lost. You are a patrician woman of Rome, and in the deep interior of your being, no less than the generals and poets of your age, you endure. Let us now walk in worn sandals beside a man whose world is made not of marble but of roads, dirt-caked, sun-baked, winding through empires. The traveling merchant is not bound to a villa, nor to a senate seat. He is bound only to the promise of coin and the whisper of new lands. Let us begin his day not in Rome, but on the road, always on the road. You awaken to bird song and the low creak of wagon wheels. Your bed is not a mattress, but a rolled cloak over a wooden cart. Last night, you camped near the edge of a small village, too remote to have a name known in Rome, but bustling enough to trade a few amphorae of oil for dried figs and cured meats. Your mule, old but faithful, snorts impatiently. She is your closest companion. Your wares are humble but diverse. Spices from the east, pepper, cumin, saffron, carefully sealed to keep their scent strong and inviting. Simple jewelry, copper rings, glass beads from Syria, dyed cloth from the southern ports. Pottery too, when you can bear the risk of breakage, and on occasion scrolls, smuggled or salvaged from forgotten places. You are more than just a trader. You are a bridge between worlds. You sipped date wine under Egyptian moons and haggled in the markets of Massalia. You've seen the temples of Carthage crumble and watched Gallic tribes sell iron knives in exchange for salt. You speak at least 4 tongues fluently, and another 3 poorly but well enough to barter. Every village you enter is a new negotiation. You must read people quickly. Who's in charge? Who's greedy? Who's drunk with power? Who might slit your throat for a bronze denarius? You learn to smile humbly, to bow a little lower than needed. You let others believe they've won the bargain. Some days, trade is good. You leave town with your cart lighter and your coin purse heavier. Other days, you leave empty-handed, cursing the weather, or local superstition, or the magistrate's wife, who insists your cloth carries curses. You sleep where you can, in stables, under trees, in the corners of taverns where men snore into spilled ale. You've eaten feasts at the tables of strangers and gnawed on stale bread alone under storm-heavy skies. You've seen corpses by the roadside robbers who tried the wrong caravan, or peasants struck down by plague. You know not to ask questions when you see blood, but for all its grit, your life is rich in stories. You've watched a solar eclipse from the prow of a merchant ship in the Aegean. You once stood beneath the towering aqueducts of Segovia, marveling at Rome's reach. In a tavern near Alexandria, you met a man who swore he'd spoken with Aristotle's ghost. You don't believe him, but you remember every word. Sometimes you miss the stability of a home, a wife, a child, but you've seen too many friends buried on foreign soil to crave roots too deeply. Still, there is a woman in Neapolis, a widow who sells olives in the port. Every time you pass through, you stay a day longer than necessary. She never asks you to remain, and you never promise to return, but you always do. Your hands are calloused, your eyes lined with sun and smoke, but you are no fool. You know the roads better than most generals. You know which inns overcharge, which bridges are unsafe, which forests hum with danger after dark, and most of all, you know how to survive. You do not write history, but you carry it. Piece by piece, item by item, whispered tale by whispered tale. Rome lives not only in its legions and libraries, but in the dust on your boots and the coins you pass from hand to hand. You are a traveling merchant, and you are the bloodstream of an empire. Let the marble fade, and the olive groves retreat. We leave behind the domes of temples and the warmth of bustling forums. The roads grow narrower, the air colder, and the shadows longer. We now travel to the edge of the Roman world, where the walls of the empire meet the wild, and where a Roman soldier greets the day not with a bath, but with the tightening of his armor. The morning begins with frost on your breath. You wake beneath a hide blanket stiffened by cold. Around you, your fellow legionaries stir, some groaning as they stretch aching limbs, others silent, already pulling on greaves and buckling belts. The wooden walls of your outpost groan faintly in the wind. Beyond them lies nothing but forest, dense, ancient, unknowable. Germania, Britannia, Dacia. The name depends on the posting, but the feeling is always the same. You are far from Rome, and the land beyond your walls does not welcome you. Your first duty is inspection. Armor polished, sword sharpened, gladius sheathed at your side. You run fingers over the segmented plates of your lorica segmentata, making sure each clasp is tight. You cannot afford carelessness. Barbarians do not announce themselves with trumpets. Breakfast is hard bread, a handful of dried beans and weak wine. No oil, no olives, no sweet figs. That is the diet of the city, of senators and poets. Here, food is fuel. You eat in silence, staring into the distance, eyes half on the meal, half on the tree line. Then it's to the drills, even on the frontier. Discipline is sacred. You march in formation across the frozen yard, wooden weapons clacking in time. You practice formations, the testudo, the wedge, the repel cavalry stance, until your arms burn and your calves scream, sweat pools beneath your tunic despite the chill. The centurion watches. He does not yell. He doesn't need to. One glare from him and men straighten their spines like saplings after a storm. He has survived too many campaigns to waste breath on fools. By midday, your duties shift. Today, you are assigned wall patrol. You walk the perimeter of the camp slowly, eyes trained on the wilderness beyond. Some say the tribes are gathering again, that they plan to test Rome's patience before winter ends. Others whisper of shadows in the woods, of strange chants carried by the wind, of cursed groves and ancient gods that do not fear the eagle of Rome. You don't believe in curses, but you keep your hand near your sword just the same. When there's no threat, you help reinforce the palisades or dig ditches around the camp. Some days, you escort traders or supply wagons from distant settlements, grim affairs where danger feels thick in the air. Other times, your work is more delicate, collecting taxes, enforcing Roman law, putting down unrest. Sometimes this means arresting a thief. Sometimes it means burning a village. You do not question the orders. Rome speaks through the scrolls, through the chain of command, through your centurion's voice, and you are a hand of Rome. As dusk approaches, you gather with your comrades in the barracks. The fire is low, the wine sour, but someone plays a reed flute. Another sings a bawdy song in Latin, and laughter follows like an old friend. You trade stories of home, of women, of wars past. You boast of wounds, but rarely of fear. No one admits fear, not here. You think of home sometimes, of your mother's stew, of the girl who said she'd wait for you, though she's likely married now. Of the warmth of a Roman summer, of soft linen sheets, of markets and bells and temples filled with incense. But your life is no longer marble and olive oil. It is grit, steel, cold wind, and sharper silence. At night you sleep with your sword within reach. You dream of battles, some real, some still waiting. You hear wolves howling beyond the walls, and you wonder, will tomorrow bring another patrol, another skirmish, another brother lost? You are a Roman soldier, and your heartbeat is the drumbeat that keeps the empire alive at its edges. There are moments between the drills and the dread when you forget you are part of something vast. The Roman Empire is a distant idea here. You don't see the Colosseum. You don't hear Cicero's speeches or see the marble-white curve of the Senate halls. You know Rome only in fragments. The eagle on your standard, the Latin words barked at sunrise, the cold coin stamped with a face you've never seen in person. Your world is made of mud and frost and orders, yet that invisible chain binds you still. You remember your first day at the frontier, the silence, the uncanny quiet of a land untouched by Roman brick or bath. You had come from the south, from sun and vineyards, from the scent of citrus and the laughter of markets. When you arrived at this outpost, the very air felt different, as if the wind carried secrets too old to name. The earth here groaned differently underfoot. Trees leaned in, listening. It was a silence too full to be empty. The local tribes, those not yet crushed under Rome's heel, watch from the woods. You rarely see them, but you feel them. Sometimes you find tokens left at the edges of the camp, bundles of feathers, small carved stones, symbols you cannot read, warnings, perhaps, or prayers. Some soldiers scoff, others mutter. Old superstitions. Everyone sharpens their swords a little more often afterward. You've been stationed here for 3 years now, long enough to lose count of the dead, long enough to recognize every face still breathing, and to feel the gap where the missing once were. Your tent mate Gaius was struck down by fever in the second winter. His cough rattled through the nights like a death drum, and when he finally fell silent, the silence felt worse than the sound. You buried him just outside the palisade, beneath a rock that bears no name. There are no marble headstones here, only memory, which fades as easily as morning mist. Once, a local uprising led your unit to torch a village at the river bend. They claimed the tribes had been harboring rebels, traitors to Rome. You do not know if that was true. You remember the children hiding in the wheat. You remember the smell. You remember how one of your comrades couldn't stop screaming afterward, not from pain but from something else, something deeper. There are ghosts here, not just of the slain but of the self you were before all this. You've changed. You move differently now. Slow, cautious, always aware of the direction of the wind and the weight of the silence. You trust no shadow. You've learned to read the eyes of strangers and the movement of clouds. You sleep like a beast in a den, never quite relaxed, always one twitch away from waking. Still there is pride in your chest. You are Roman. You carry an empire in your veins. You are part of a machine that stretches from the deserts of Africa to the snowy hills of Britannia. You build roads through darkness. You carve order into chaos. You are the reason the borders hold, and sometimes in rare moments there is peace. Like when a supply caravan arrives from the south and you taste real wine again. When someone from the capital brings news of victories, of new emperors, of gladiators you once saw as a child, or when during a quiet evening you stare up at the stars, the very same constellations that shine above the Forum and the Tiber. You remember that Rome too is watching, that the stars above your outpost are no different than those over the Palatine Hill, and even in this lonely, feral land, you are not forgotten. Because you are the spear at the edge of the world, and when you finally return home, if you return home, you will carry stories carved into your soul, tales that even marble cannot hold. Let us step quietly now, away from the clash of swords and the dust of faraway frontiers, and into the hush of sacred marble halls. We move where few are allowed, where the air is thick with incense and solemn vows. The life of a Roman priestess was not one of combat or commerce, but of profound duty. a life offered up to the divine. She rises before the sun, always before the sun. The city beyond the temple still sleeps, its noises muffled by night's lingering veil. But within the sanctuary, the silence is deliberate, sacred. Every footstep echoes like a prayer. She is a priestess of Vesta, the virgin goddess of the hearth. One of the 6 chosen Vesta virgins, perhaps, selected as a child, taken from her family to serve for 30 years. In that time she is not a daughter, not a wife, not a mother. She belongs not to a man, nor to herself. She belongs to Rome. She lights the sacred flame, the fire that must never go out. That flickering heart of the temple is more than fire. It is the spirit of the city. So long as it burns, Rome stands. If it ever dies, well, it must not die. There is power in her hands, though her touch is gentle.
The Vestals can pardon criminals, protect wills and sacred documents, walk without escort. Men lower their voices in their presence. Senators nod in deference. Even emperors speak with reverence. And yet her freedom is a paradox. Her life is a series of rituals, ceremonies that have not changed in generations. She purifies, she prays, she weaves wool for the goddess. Each act, no matter how small, is part of the great machinery that keeps Rome aligned with the will of the gods. She remembers when she was first brought here, only 6 years old, eyes wide, too young to understand what she was surrendering. Her mother wept silently. Her father, proud, stood tall. A daughter chosen by the gods was an honor few families ever dreamed of. But even then, she felt it, a subtle tearing from the world she once knew. The other priestesses became her sisters. Older ones taught her how to wash the sacred implements, how to speak the prayers without falter, how to walk with dignity even when her feet ached and the incense stung her eyes. She learned to bear witness to births and funerals, to sacrifices and omens, always watching, always apart, but always central. But she is not stone. She dreams sometimes of laughter, of running through open fields, of holding a child, of someone whispering her name with love instead of reverence. She dreams of undoing her elaborate veil, of letting her hair fall, of choosing. She does not speak of these dreams. To falter in her vow of chastity would be to invite death, not metaphorical, but real. A Vestal who breaks her oath is buried alive, walled within the earth, while Rome above pretends not to hear her final cries. And so she holds the line. Each day, each ritual, she becomes part of something older than herself. She knows that Rome believes its survival rests on her discipline, and perhaps that belief is power in itself. Still, there are moments. At dusk, when the light in the temple softens and the flame flickers just so, she sometimes feels the presence of Vesta herself. A warmth, not from fire, but from something deeper, as though the goddess is not just an idea, but a presence watching, listening, comforting. She does not cry. A Vestal does not cry. But in that warmth, she feels seen. And when her 30 years are complete, she will be free. Free to marry, to speak openly, to live for herself. Yet many do not. The world outside the temple becomes strange after so long. Some choose to remain unmarried, forever devout. Some become advisors, keepers of wisdom. Others fade into the quiet corners of aristocracy. But for now, she walks in silence between flame and marble, between duty and the divine, between the city and the gods. And Rome unknowingly breathes easier because of her. She doesn't awaken to the crowing of roosters or the shuffle of family life. She wakes to silence, to the hush of sanctity. Her bed is simple, her chamber plain, though nestled within the Atrium Vestae, a grand house adjacent to the temple of Vesta itself.
Marble floors cold against bare feet, draped windows filtering the golden light of dawn into long, solemn rays. She is not alone, and yet she lives in a world apart. Among 5 others, each bearing the same oath, the same burden, and the same strange comfort. They are her sisters, but not in the way peasant girls share chores or patrician daughters share secrets. There is closeness, yes, but beneath it, an undercurrent of constant surveillance, of shared duty. If the sacred flame were to ever go out, even for a moment, the blame would ripple through them all like a crack in polished stone. When she was chosen, the ceremony felt like a dream. The Pontifex Maximus laid hands on her. Her family stood stiffly, choking back pride and heartbreak. Her hair was cut, a child's hair, soft, thin, and still scented by the oils her mother once rubbed into her scalp. She felt the weight of the veil then, and not just the physical linen draped across her brow. She felt the centuries settle over her shoulders, the immovable weight of Roman expectation. Now, years later, the veil is as much a part of her as her own name. When she walks through the forum, people bow their heads, not in fear, but in awe. Her presence is both sacred and unsettling. She cannot be touched. She cannot be harmed. Even criminals seek her gaze, praying she might intervene and grant a pardon. Her word carries weight in court. Her body is a living contract with the divine. And yet, how quiet it is to carry a role so immense. The days are a cycle of rites. In the morning she tends the fire with cedar and olive wood, feeding it as though it were a living being. She murmurs the ancient invocations, words that were old even in the time of Caesar. She sprinkles salted flour and wine, maintaining purity through repetition. Every movement is ritual. Even how she walks is watched. No stumbling, no rushed steps. The Vestal must move as if time bends around her. There are moments of rare beauty, when spring festivals rise and the streets bloom with garlands, when children laugh under petals, and when the Vestals lead processions through Rome, dressed in ivory, veiled like brides of the gods. In those moments, she feels the eyes of the city upon her, some with reverence, others with something harder to define. Envy, maybe, or fascination, but there is also a loneliness the city never sees. She has not spoken to her brother in years, not hugged her mother, not been held, not kissed. She cannot weep in public, cannot laugh too loudly, cannot whisper idle gossip. The pleasures of womanhood, flirtation, courtship, even motherhood are closed to her. At times, she feels removed from her own body, like a statue, a revered object. People lower their eyes, not out of respect, but because they fear what she represents. Rome's precarious bargain with the gods. If she fails, if she breaks her vow, the punishment is not symbolic. She remembers a story told by one of the elder priestesses of a Vestal long ago who was found guilty. Though no one would say exactly how they knew, her lover was whipped to death in the forum, and she, wrapped in her ceremonial garments, was escorted by torchlight to a small underground chamber just outside the city walls, given a loaf of bread, a lamp, some water, then buried alive. The earth took her, as was tradition. The city could not shed priestess blood, so the earth did it instead. This is the price of being sacred, and yet she believes, she truly believes, in Vesta, in fire, in the silent thrum of the gods that lingers in the temple's echo. There are moments when she feels touched by something immense, while chanting alone in the dim light, while weaving the sacred threads, while placing her palm over the stone altar, and feeling warmth that seems to rise not from the sun but from the divine. She has dreams she never speaks aloud, of walking barefoot through a field, unbound, of letting her hair down, of sleeping beside someone simply because she wanted to, not because duty dictated where she lay, and yet when she wakes from those dreams, she rises and walks back into the temple, always, because she is the flame, she is the silence. She is the sacrifice Rome does not see, but cannot live without, and when her 30 years are done, she may choose to live freely, but some do not, because after decades spent as a symbol, as a bridge between mortals and gods, the world beyond the temple feels unbearably loud. Some priestesses stay near the sacred places all their lives, not because they must, but because they have nowhere else to belong.